Imagine this. It's late Saturday night. The Senate floor is buzzing. Senators are walking around, maybe twisting some arms. Last-minute deals happening.
Yeah.
Sounds like a movie, right?
Yeah, like a political thriller.
Exactly. But this was real life just recently on Capitol Hill. Welcome to the Daily Scope podcast, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we're looking into this huge, 1,000-page bill. It's basically President Trump's policy agenda wrapped up in one package, and it just got pushed through a key Senate vote. So we're going to unpack what's really inside it, how it managed to pass, because that was dramatic, and what it could mean for, everyone.
And what really jumps out when you look at the sources we have is just the size of this thing and how fast it moved. Our goal here isn't just to tell you what happened. We want to dig into the why. Why does this bill matter? What's the bigger picture, the potential impact? It's a really good example of how massive laws can sometimes get pushed through so quickly, maybe too quickly, for proper review.
Okay, let's start with that vote. It was 51-49 in the Senate on Saturday. That is razor thin.
Yeah, really tight.
It tells you this wasn't some big consensus moment. Leaders are calling it a once-in-a-generation opportunity, but getting it through by just 2 votes? That sounds more like a high-wire act.
It definitely was. And that phrase, once in a generation, you hear that from Senator Thune, the majority leader. It sounds grand, like something everyone agrees on. But the sources, well, they paint a different picture. They talk about huge fiscal issues, controversial add-ons, a process that wasn't exactly transparent.
Right.
So it goes from sounding like bold reform to something more like rushed policymaking. And it makes you wonder, what is reform in this situation? Is it just getting your agenda passed, or does it need, open debate?
That's a really important distinction. And driving this whole thing is what our sources are calling a very specific Trumpian vision of American exceptionalism. It's not random policies, it's a whole philosophy.
Okay.
So what does that mean? Well, first, lots of deregulation, cutting back rules on businesses, environment, finance. Second, big increases in defense spending. Like a lot more money for the Pentagon.
Right.
And third, broad tax cuts, especially aimed at corporations and higher earners, with that idea that it'll eventually benefit everyone. It's a very top-down approach.
And if you look at the specific spending, it really brings that vision into focus. For example, there's a massive $160 billion for border enforcement.
$160 billion. Wow.
Yeah, and that's not just a wall. It's tech, more personnel, upgrading ports of entry. A huge investment.
So border security is clearly a massive priority here. What else stands out in the bill?
Well, on the economic side, you've got extensions of those 2017 Trump tax cuts. That keeps lower corporate rates and other benefits going.
Okay, the tax cuts make sense within that philosophy.
But then there are some, let's say, unique things, like completely eliminating taxes on tips.
Tax on tips, gone.
Apparently. Seems targeted maybe towards service workers. You don't usually see that in big tax bills.
Interesting. Anything else unusual?
Yeah, allowing deductions on loans for American-made cars.
Right.
Trying to boost U.S. auto manufacturing, clearly.
Okay, so specific incentives there.
And then a really big one. Another $150 billion boost to the Pentagon's budget.
Another $150 billion for defense on top of everything else.
Exactly. So these aren't small changes. They're major shifts in spending and national priorities, really reflecting that specific vision we talked about.
It's definitely a huge bill with a clear agenda. But getting it through wasn't smooth sailing, was it? The sources say cracks widened right before the vote.
Not at all smooth.
It sounds like real drama. Senators trying to whip votes, leadership just hoping they had enough.
Yeah, clinging to a fragile majority, as the sources put it. The fact that it took so much last-minute scrambling tells you there was serious disagreement within the Republican Party.
So it wasn't a unified front.
Far from it. And we have some great examples. Take Senator Tim Sheehy. He's a freshman from Montana. He almost stopped the whole thing.
A freshman senator?
Yeah.
Really? How?
Well, there was this provision pushed by Senator Mike Lee from Utah about selling off millions of acres of federal public land.
Public lands. That's always sensitive, especially out west.
Extremely. And Sheehy objected strongly. Apparently, he only agreed to vote yes after leadership promised him a separate vote later to remove that land sale language.
One freshman senator had enough leverage to force a concession on a major bill.
It seems so. It really shows the power individual senators can have, especially when the margin is so tight.
And she wasn't the only one causing headaches for leadership.
Nope. Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. The sources describe it as almost an ambush of lobbying by senior Republican leaders on the Senate floor.
On the floor, like right before the vote.
Yeah, imagine being surrounded by leadership, intense pressure, right there in public view. It shows just how hard they had to fight for every single vote.
That's incredible pressure. But some didn't cave, right? 2 Republicans voted no.
That's right, 2 held firm. First, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky.
Okay, what was his reason?
Predictably, it was the money. Specifically, the staggering $5 trillion debt limit increase included in the bill.
$5 trillion.
Trillion with a T. For a fiscal hawk like Rand Paul, who's always warning about debt, that was just too much. He sees it as fiscally reckless.
Okay, so Paul's objection was about the overall debt. Who was the other no vote?
Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina. His reason was much more specific to his state.
How so?
His office estimated the bill would lead to a $38.9 billion loss to his state's federal Medicaid funding over time.
Wow, almost $40 billion in Medicaid cuts just for North Carolina.
That's what his office projected. He said flat out, I cannot support this bill in its current form. He talked about the impact on hospitals, rural communities. It wasn't abstract for him. It was about health care for his constituents.
So those Medicaid cuts were a major sticking point.
Definitely. And it wasn't just Tillis. Think about Senator Susan Collins from Maine. She's often seen as a moderate Republican barometer.
Right, the canary in the coal mine. What did she do?
She voted to advance the bill, but apparently just out of deference to leadership. She made it very clear she might vote no on final passage.
So her vote was conditional.
Highly conditional. She explicitly said she wants further changes, specifically mentioning the Medicaid cuts again, and that she'd be filing amendments.
So even the yes votes weren't all solid endorsements.
Exactly. These internal fights, especially over Medicaid and the debt, showed just how divided the party is on parts of this bill and how much negotiation is still needed if it's going to actually become law.
Okay, let's circle back to those Medicaid cuts because Senator Tillis's number for North Carolina was huge. What's the overall picture on healthcare funding in this bill? I mean, what does this mean for the country's bottom line?
Well, according to a preliminary CBO report, that's the Congressional Budget Office, which Democrats were apparently circulating, the picture is, frankly, alarming.
How alarming?
The estimate is that the bill cuts Medicaid by $930 billion.
$930 billion, nearly $1 trillion from Medicaid.
That's the figure in the preliminary report. One source called it a generational restructuring of healthcare for the vulnerable. It's not just trimming. It's a fundamental change to how healthcare for low-income individuals, people with disabilities, the elderly, is funded.
That certainly puts Senator Tillis's $39 billion concern into a much larger context.
Absolutely. It suggests a massive nationwide impact. It really makes you think, how do you balance potential economic stimulus from tax cuts against such deep cuts to a major social safety net? What are your thoughts on that trade-off? Let us know in the comments.
And let's not forget Rand Paul's issue, that $5 trillion debt limit increase.
Yeah.
That's floating around in this bill, too. Can you break that down? What does raising the debt limit by that much actually do?
Well, fundamentally, it allows the government to borrow more money to pay its bills it already owes, plus future spending authorized by Congress. The current debt is already, around $34 trillion?
Something like that, yeah.
So adding $5 trillion to the ceiling basically greenlights borrowing that pushes us towards $40 trillion pretty quickly. It signals a commitment to continued high spending levels for years.
And the potential downsides of that.
Economists worry about things like inflation, rising interest rates, making borrowing more expensive for everyone, and just the sheer burden of interest payments on future taxpayers. It locks in a certain fiscal path.
Which leads to a big question the sources raise: transparency. They point out that the Republicans haven't released a full public CBO score detailing the long-term fiscal impact of the whole bill.
Right.
For a bill this huge, cutting Medicaid by nearly $1 trillion, raising the debt limit by $5 trillion.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't that full analysis be public before the vote?
That's the million-dollar question, or maybe the trillion-dollar question here. Usually you'd expect a detailed CBO score laying out costs and savings over, say, 10 years. Not having that publicly available makes it really hard for anyone's citizens, even other lawmakers, to fully grasp the financial consequences. It kind of fuels suspicion and makes it harder to have an informed debate about whether the bill's economic assumptions actually hold water.
Okay, so we have internal fighting, massive fiscal questions. But the criticism isn't just coming from inside D.C., right? You mentioned a surprising voice weighing in.
Yeah, this one definitely caught attention. Elon Musk.
Elon Musk, what did he say?
He went on X Twitter and called the bill utterly insane and destructive.
Whoa, strong words. Did he say why?
He seemed focused on it being a giveaway to fossil fuel industries and claimed it was a betrayal of America's technological future, suggesting it undermines green tech and innovation.
But the source also mentioned something about Musk himself, right? A bit of context.
Yeah, a little jab, noting he's never a fan of government handouts to less fortunate, despite being the king of government handouts himself.
So pointing out his own companies benefit from government support.
Exactly. It adds a layer, right? Is his criticism purely policy-based, or does it maybe intersect with his own business interests in EVs, solar, space areas that compete with traditional energy? It makes you question the motives behind some public pronouncements, even if the points raised are valid. What do you think drives critiques like Musk's?
It's definitely something to consider. And speaking of things that raise questions, the process itself. Dropping that massive 940-page amendment late Friday night before a Saturday vote, that seems problematic.
Deeply problematic. Imagine being a senator or staffer, getting nearly 1,000 pages of complex legislation hours before you have to vote on it. How can you possibly do due diligence?
It feels like you can't. It seems designed to prevent careful reading.
And that's exactly how the Democrats reacted. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, he blasted the move.
What did he do?
He announced they'd use a Senate rule to have the entire bill read aloud on the floor, an ordeal estimated to take about 12 hours.
12 hours of reading the bill out loud.
Yep. It's a delay tactic, sure, but it also forces everything into the open and could trigger what's called a vote-a-rama, endless amendment votes. It's basically procedural warfare.
So the late-night drop was met with a slowdown tactic.
Exactly. It shows how the process itself becomes a political weapon, affecting transparency, efficiency, and ultimately how legitimate the final law feels.
Okay, we've covered the content, the internal fights, the money, the outside noise, the process drama. Let's try to pull this together. What are the big takeaways? What does this all mean?
Well, from the perspective of the bill's supporters, they'll say this is exactly what they promised. A return to conservative basics. Tax cuts, border security, strong defense, less regulation. They see it as needed medicine for the economy and national security.
But the way it happened. The sources really hammer this point, pushing it through with, quote, legislative sleight of hand, backroom deals, and brute force politics. That language suggests the process itself is undermining the policy.
It really does. It raises questions about trust. If you have to use those methods to pass a bill, does it damage faith in how laws are made, regardless of the bill's content?
Especially when it's happening, as the sources say, in the shadow of mounting debt, unclear budget projections, and open rebellion within their own ranks. The context isn't exactly stable.
Right. It makes you ask, is the short-term win of passing the bill worth the potential long-term costs to party unity, fiscal stability, and public trust?
And then there was that July 4th deadline that former President Trump reportedly wanted. The source called it patriotic deadline. Good for TV, but bad for responsible lawmaking. What's the risk of rushing for a symbolic date?
The risk is that you prioritize optics over substance. You might hit the deadline, get the headline, but maybe you bake mistakes into the law because you didn't take the time to properly vet it. It can also just poison the well for future cooperation if one side feels like they were steamrolled for a photo op. It suggests political calculation is trumping careful governing.
So what's the bottom line here, according to the sources?
The sources basically conclude that the Republican Party might succeed in passing this bill, enacting this vision, but at a significant cost. And that cost isn't just measured in dollars or the deficit figures we talked about, but in the integrity of the process itself. For a party that historically emphasized fiscal conservatism and following procedure, the sources seem to ask, can they pass Trump's vision? Maybe. But can the country and the political system really afford how it's being done? The process has become as big a story as the policy.
That really leaves us with a fundamental question, doesn't it? This whole situation forces us to ask, when does moving fast in Washington become just plain reckless? And what's the price we all pay in terms of the economy, social programs, and maybe most importantly, our trust in government when legislation happens this way? We really want to know what you think. What part of this whole legislative drama stands out most to you? Let us know in the comments below. We read them all. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this episode a like, subscribe to a Daily Scope podcast so you don't miss our next analysis, and definitely hit that notification bell. Thanks for tuning in.